Okay. Okay.
Okay, here
Let
we
them
go.
in.
I'm gonna let them in.
Yep. You have no faith in me. A lot of
Progress.
chemicals.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, Sharon.
How are you?
Good. I'm
Good.
very well. How are you?
Good, good, good. Sorry. I'm trying to find a good
I'm
angle.
about to mute everybody and keep it that way.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Later, Gator.
Later.
Rachel, can you locate Ramona? I see her.
Well, apparently Pepper were the host of so far.
If you are named Karen Savell and you are not me, please feel free to rename yourselves, or if you need help, we will be glad to rename you for you. Okay, we're going to begin now. Ramona?
So I want to welcome everybody to this meeting. I think we're all in for a very interesting talk about something that we really don't know very much about. The importance of remembering is critical. You see with the rise of anti-Semitism, the saying that everybody loves dead Jews is very apropos. People are, all kinds of people are perfectly willing to commemorate the Holocaust, but they don't take the lessons of the Holocaust seriously. They don't apply them to people beyond Jews, and they don't think about what discrimination and hate speech can lead to. So we must never forget, and we must never forget that the lessons for a broader public, but we must always remember that we were the targeted people, and that it is not completely unreasonable to think that we would be targeted again. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Karen to introduce our program.
Thank you, Ramona. Before we introduce our speaker tonight, we're going to watch a short video.
Karen, I'm having troubles with the sharing.
Okay.
Years ago, during the night of November 9th and 10th, 1938, coordinated attacks against Jews occurred throughout Nazi Germany and its annexed territories. Thousands were arrested, Jewish homes and shops were destroyed, and synagogues were burned down. The violence came to be known as Kristallnacht, or the night of broken glass, due to the shards of glass that covered the streets from broken shop windows. When Chancellor Adolf Hitler started employing extreme anti-Semitic rhetoric in Germany in the 1930s, he was building upon centuries of anti-Jewish sentiment. The first forms of such prejudice date back to ancient times and have been present in many countries since then. After Hitler blamed Jews for the economic and social damage incurred during World War I, Germany adopted anti-Jewish legislation and started viewing Jews as a group that could not assimilate into European society. Jews were gradually segregated from the rest of the population, and their businesses were boycotted. On November 7th, 1938, a young Polish Jew named Herschel Grinspan walked into the German embassy in Paris. In revenge for his family and the thousands of other Jews who had been expelled from Germany, he shot a Nazi diplomatic officer, Ernst von Rath. 2 days later, after von Rath died of his wounds, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels delivered a fiery speech using the killing as pretext for retaliation. On November 9th, 1938, Nazi paramilitary forces and civilians began demolishing Jewish homes and other buildings throughout Germany and the annexed parts of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Over the course of 48 hours, 267 synagogues were destroyed and more than 7,000 shops were damaged. The German authorities looked on without intervening. More than 90 Jews were killed in the rampage, and 30,000 Jewish males were detained per instructions to arrest as many young and healthy men as local prisons could hold. They were later deported to concentration camps. Immediately after Kristallnacht, Jews were blamed for the riots and were fined 1 billion Reichsmark, or about $400 million. The government also confiscated all insurance payouts for properties damaged during the violence. Today, Kristallnacht is considered to mark the beginning of the Holocaust, in which Nazi Germany and its collaborators murdered some 6 million Jews.
Great. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone see me okay? Okay. Rachel, because you're on full screen. You're on a pin screen. Okay, so good evening and welcome. What impact does anti-Semitism have on others? What do people gain from scapegoating? And what is the effect of hateful images and speech? The history of the Holocaust shows us that targeting an entire group has far-reaching consequences, and it can lead to an increase in xenophobia, racism, extremism, and throughout all society. So why is it still relevant today to remember nights like Kristallnacht? Well, recently, Texas passed legislation that might allow educators to teach opposing views of the Holocaust and other historic events. Police removed a man from a school board meeting in Birmingham, Michigan, for using a Nazi salute and shouting Heil Hitler to protest a student mask mandate. And in Connecticut, our own Governor Lamont was called Hitler for his handling of mask and vaccine mandate propositions. And the list from 2021 goes on and on. Tonight, we're going to have a meaningful conversation with Jonathan Feinstein. He is the state director for the Texas Education Trust. Jonathan brings more than 15 years of experience in education as a teacher, organizer, nonprofit leader. He serves as the state director of the Texas Education Trust, where he works with and supports partners statewide to advance educational equality for students of color and from low-income backgrounds. Jonathan holds a bachelor degree from Wesleyan University in American Studies with a concentration in ethnic studies. Please help me welcome Jonathan Feinstein tonight. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be with you. Thank you for that introduction. I think to start, I'd like to just share a little bit more about myself beyond that wonderful introduction. And I hope that'll give you a better idea of why I'm here and the perspective that I bring to our topic this evening. I grew up in a household in a Reformed synagogue in the South, in North Carolina, that ingrained the values of remembrance, of peace and justice, and an obligation to stand up and speak out against injustice. Most of the lessons I remember learning about the oppression of the Jewish people and of the Holocaust in particular ended with injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. As was mentioned, I attended Wesleyan University. I think that's a little bit further west in Connecticut, where I studied American history through that lens of ethnic studies, an academic movement to validate the multitude of experiences that have contributed to our nation's development. That learning included the stolen land of Indigenous Americans, the stolen labor of enslaved Africans, and the fluid racial identity of European Jewish immigrants. I'm also coming to you as a fellow American, a believer in the foundational values of our country, most notably that all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. I believe that our country is a work in progress, that progress is never made in a straight line, and that achieving a better future requires us to learn lessons from the past. Finally, I'm a former classroom teacher and an advocate who, as was mentioned, wakes up every day with the mission to ensure that every child in Texas feels welcome in our schools and that our schools serve as the true ladders of opportunity for all students, but especially our Black and Latino students and students from low-income backgrounds who have historically been underserved as a result of centuries of slavery and segregation that have caused those enduring education inequities. And I'm here tonight because I believe that schools and children have been turned into an afterthought, collateral damage in a fundamentally political battle. But before going any further, just a few boundaries I'd like to offer for tonight's conversation. First, if you haven't already, you may experience some strong emotions. Be aware of them, as well as the diverse experiences, perspectives, and identities that we all hold. Second, you probably will have lots of questions that I'm unable to answer. I ask that you accept that, admit what you don't know, and keep learning. For example, I won't try to be an expert on the Holocaust, on Jewish history or theology, because I'm not. And finally, and most importantly, I'd like to invite you to center our human values, informed by Jewish teachings and rituals, not by our partisan or political identities. As I said, I'm not an expert on Kristallnacht. The video that we just watched reinforced what I knew before. And even that the name itself, which we continue to carry, the Night of Broken Glass, was given by the Nazis as a euphemism for the violence and brutality that, as we just heard, destroyed thousands of Jewish businesses, homes, and schools, took 91 Jewish lives, and led to the arrest of 30,000 Jewish men who were then sent to concentration camps. Of course, the Nazis then blamed and imposed fines on Jews, and was, as was shared, marked this turning point, right, from hateful rhetoric and legislation to the extermination of the Holocaust that was facilitated by this widespread, everyday collaboration. And tonight we're here to remember this painful truth. As much discomfort and pain and anguish as it brings us, as it should, we remember. So why? Because of a fundamental tradition and teaching that we must remember if we're to prevent such atrocities from happening again. We have to face the truth of this history, no matter how ugly or even as long ago as it may seem, to learn from it and to stand in the way of anti-Semitism, of hatred, and genocide. And as Romana said, this seems especially necessary today as anti-Semitism is on the rise and knowledge of the Holocaust declines. And I haven't confirmed this, but a friend of mine reminded me over Shabbat dinner just this week that even following the 48 hours of violent brutality that we're commemorating, there were many Jews who debated whether to remain silent or to stand up for their own survival. So why is an education equity advocate from Texas telling you this? I'm guessing that word reached Eastern Connecticut that in a school district in South Lake, Texas, there were some teachers who were instructed to teach, quote unquote, opposing views of the Holocaust. Before telling you as succinctly as I can how such words could ever reach the mouths of a district administrator, just a little bit about background about Southlake in particular, which is not that unlike many affluent suburbs in Texas. There is a lot of community pride in the quality of the schools. And while the demographics are changing, they serve a predominantly white Christian student body. Following several instances of racial bullying and harassment experienced by Black students and others in the schools, a diverse committee spent many months developing what they called a cultural competency action plan. And just as it was set for school board approval, a very politicized backlash stopped it in its tracks, coinciding with much larger national and state forces. So I could go much further back, but I think that the connection to these forces starts most immediately with Charlottesville, Virginia, and the subsequent rise in white nationalism and anti-Semitism that intensified, especially in the wake of then President Trump's remarks that there were quote unquote good people on both sides. While this rise simmered to the surface, our nation's perpetual reckoning with racism continued, with efforts like the New York Times publication of the 1619 Project in August of 2019, commemorating the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans arriving in colonial Virginia. And then following the murder of George Floyd in summer 2020, a nationwide protest for racial justice accelerated and expanded conversations about the manifestations of racism into our workplaces, places of worship, homes, government entities, and yes, schools. These conversations probably felt long overdue to many and new and uncomfortable to others, as they included overt acts of interpersonal racism, but also questioned the role of policies and systems. As the 2020 election cycle neared, a Republican strategist named Chris Rufo appeared on Fox News and introduced critical race theory as a catch-all term designed to freeze these conversations and rebrand them using false claims of teachers indoctrinating students, shaming white students, and presenting the teaching of America's history of racism as divisive, as unpatriotic. Only a couple of days later, then President Trump issued 2 executive orders, one combating race and sex stereotyping, and another establishing the 1776 Commission. This explicitly political strategy has led to an assault on the pursuit of equity in education, the disruption of school instruction, the flooding of school board meetings, and the passage of dangerous laws like those that we've seen in Texas. Indeed, much of the exact language from Trump's executive order has been directly copied into bills like Texas House Bill 3979, which Governor Abbott signed in June, and then Senate Bill 3, which he signed in September after asking the state legislature to, quote, do more to abolish critical race theory in Texas. And less than 2 weeks ago, a state House representative who is running for Attorney General in Texas used his position as chair of the General Investigating Committee to ask school districts to report their library catalogs against a list of 850 books. House Bill 3979, which will be superseded by Senate Bill 3, which becomes effective next month, included this language. I'm quoting from the bill. For any social studies course in the required curriculum, 1, a teacher may not be compelled to discuss a particular current event or widely debated and currently controversial issue of public policy or social affairs. And 2, a teacher who chooses to discuss a topic described above, to the best of the teacher's ability, must strive to explore the topic from diverse and contending perspectives without giving deference to any one perspective. And that is where the headlines from Southlake derive. I will tell you what I've told others in Texas and across the country. It is the cultural and political environment operating outside of any specific legislation that does most of the work. The misinformation, media amplification, and political mobilization is what contributes to the chilling effect felt by teachers and students. But it is these legislative and regulatory actions which give these same forces credibility, cover, and fuel. So please make no mistake, these sweeping measures do work to censor classroom discussions and ban conversations about racism, discrimination, and inequality. And as a former educator, I promise you, I understand that it's necessary to facilitate age-appropriate learning. But these are conversations that help kids learn empathy, to understand the painful parts of our history, to recognize inequality in society today, and ultimately to become stronger leaders who refuse to repeat the mistakes of the past. These bans undermine our children's education and their ability to learn important life skills. They infringe on fundamental freedoms, and they ultimately harm our country's future. This is not just something that's happening in Texas or school boards in red states. After last week's election results in Virginia, I can guarantee that these political battles will start to show up in every state, in every community. In Texas, these attacks are being countered at every turn, thanks to the persistent and the coordinated advocacy that has included many of the Jewish federations. Along with students, teachers, parents, and business leaders, we mobilized hundreds of individuals to testify at our Capitol in Austin, and thousands of constituents to visit or contact their legislative offices against this kind of legislation. Before I open up to questions, I'll just kind of close with this. There's been lots of polling done in recent weeks of parents in particular, but of all Americans. And they agree across the political spectrum, across all races and backgrounds, that discrimination and racism do exist in America today, and that we should be able to talk about this in our schools. They also agree that we should highlight historical events and figures that may have been neglected in the curriculum in the past, including things that are uncomfortable about our nation's history. But right now, there are too many members of this majority who remain silent. And so I just feel like as we remember Kristallnacht tonight, I ask everybody listening, will we speak up? Will we take this opportunity and the lessons that we've learned from our own history as Jews in America, as we reflect on these painful events, to do our best to speak our truth? Because when we do that, we give permission to others to do the same. Those are the remarks that I had prepared. I'm sure that lots of people have questions based on what I've shared, and I'm willing to talk further about that.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And yes, questions have been coming in the chat box the whole time. So let's begin. What challenges have been made to the legislation, if any?
When we say what challenges, so I know that there are legal challenges that are being prepared specifically in Texas. There have been legal challenges I know underway in other states. In fact, in Oklahoma, just north of us, there are already lawsuits that have been filed. I think that the other forms of challenge, I will say, in a state that is dominated by one party, and that we've been involved with at the legislative level, have looked like talking specifically to legislative offices to bring forward and gain support for as many amendments, frankly, that we can offer that attempt to clarify the bill's intent, mitigate its impact, and frankly, draw attention to many of the anticipated abuses and misinterpretations that we expect. So for example, Senate Bill 3, which is the new version of the bill that you may have mentioned in the invitation, does have some things that protect student speech against potentially chilling effects, that protect educators against private legal actions, that protect our curriculum against interpretation that would prohibit the teaching of state standards, protection of classroom activities that involve students communicating with elected officials. And we even won removal of, I think, what's a really important, one of these restricted concepts that basically says that bans any concept that would make an individual feel discomfort. I'm quoting here: discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of that individual's race or sex. And it was, again, a lot of the behind the scenes and public advocacy that allowed us to, again, in the political context that we're in Texas, get that concept removed from the latest version of the legislation.
Thank you. To your knowledge, have any of the teachers unions, organizations, or even Jewish organizations come out vocally against this legislation? Are we doing anything in Texas?
Yes, as I said, there are nearly 100 organizations that publicly opposed what was then House Bill 3979. That list of organizations certainly included many of the Jewish federations from across parts of Texas, but it also certainly included teachers associations as very vocal opponents of the bill. And I think that as this bill has started to go into effect, as we've started to see some of the harmful impacts of the bill on the ground, we continue to see individuals and organizations that feel it necessary that if they had not previously spoken up, that it is increasingly time to do so.
Thank you. The next question, and I'm not sure, this is interesting. What is your view on the attacks on Jews on Muncie and Brooklyn?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with a specific incident. Sorry.
I'm going to move on here. It says, specifically with Jews being the most attacked minority in the United States, what are your steps to combat anti-Semitism coming from both part of the political spectrum? And I'm going to just be brave here and say coming from the education standpoint, because this goes on to say, both sides of the political spectrum, this topic would be more relevant to the commemoration of our killed and humiliated ancestors.
Okay, so I'm trying to parse out a little bit of the question. So, I mean, I will say personally, and I am a Jewish American, I try not to get into conversations about who's most or least oppressed or where we fall on some spectrum of oppression. In my opinion, oppression is oppression and silencing is silencing. And it's my belief that we are all best served when we allow multiple perspectives and viewpoints to flourish without restricting individuals' freedom of speech. That one of the surest ways I think that we can sow division and potentially sow misinformation is to take the kinds of overreaching steps that we've seen state legislators take that violate some of our fundamental principles, I think, as Americans, which is the freedom of speech. It is the free expression of ideas. And I think it's the honest exploration of history and the concession that we should continue to really dig deeper into those source materials that can tell us what the accurate and truth of our history reveals. I don't know that should be a partisan issue. And I'm not certain exactly what the question is trying to uplift, but I'm happy to talk more. I'm not exactly sure what I might be missing.
I think some of it, if I can read into this, this being the commemoration of Kristallnacht, and I guess what we're wondering is how does something like this happen in 2021 in the state of Texas, and is it clearly not relegated to just the state of Texas, and they're hitting us at our core, which is in the education system. So what can we do to do a turnaround there?
So it was first question was kind of how did we get here? Why is this happening?
Exactly.
Well, as I tried to say in my remarks, I think that, again, this is a pretty overtly, fundamentally political battle. This isn't an actual education discussion. This isn't, in my opinion, and from what I've witnessed, a deep discussion about what and how we teach the past. That there are forces, I think, who have identified race and history as a place where they can tap into emotional reactions in particular parts of our country. And I think it's not a mistake that a lot of what I've seen here in Texas is happening in suburban communities. I talked about South Lake. I don't think South Lake is unique in Texas. I don't think it's unique in our country. Our suburbs have traditionally been places, I think, if I go back in history, where during desegregation in America, many families fled. It's called white flight in Texas, and probably in other parts. And that over the course of the last, especially 20, 25 years, those suburbs have become more and more racially diverse, religiously diverse. And I think a number of communities are wrestling with the fact that maybe what was the norm in their community may no longer be the norm, that there may need to actually be some accommodation of new experiences, of new voices, and that perhaps a recognition that our schools and other shared public spaces have not actually always been inclusive and welcoming for all groups. And I think that there is a deep-seated fear, quite honestly, that many have, that when we make our spaces, our curriculums, our schools more reflective of a broader diversity of voices and experiences, that somehow it's a zero-sum game, that one group has to lose at another group's gain. And I don't think that that is actually what, certainly what I think our students feel or want. But I think that much of that sentiment is what is being tapped into by, I think, falsely identifying, our schools as being these places where, we are trying to indoctrinate young children, or, to make a certain group of kids feel bad about their identity and such. So I think why this is happening is the result of a lot of very powerful political forces that, to me, don't seem to resonate with much of the reality that I see and hear when I talk to educators and to school leaders and to parents as well.
And so you're coming from this from a predominantly, I'm going to say, red state. We're in a predominantly blue state, and it's happening here as well. We've not gone as far as education, but this seems to be a national trend, which is why we were so interested in hearing about why these things come about in this country in 2021. You mentioned a list of books. Are they banning some books in some schools there? Are there certain Holocaust or Jewish history books that are coming under attack?
So this was just a couple of weeks ago, but I mentioned that there was again, and this goes to why this is happening. So I'm not going to mention his name, but there is a state house rep who is from the North Texas area, who I'd say very few Texans across the state probably knew his name, but he happens to be running for attorney general, a statewide race. So what do you do if you're a Republican who is seeking to get free name recognition? You use your position to do something that is almost certain to gain statewide headlines. And so what does he do? He writes a letter to every school district in the state, and he produces a list of these 850 books. I will tell you, I have not bothered to scan every single title to know which ones are targeting Black authors or female authors or LGBTQ authors or even Jewish authors or subjects. But you do that, and guess what? The next week, and possibly even beyond that, every single media outlet is largely, I would say, decrying the fact that this is happening, but nonetheless, bringing attention to this individual's name, which only serves to benefit his political prospects as he appeals to a base of folks who again, may be receptive to the idea that these books are beyond the pale for kids to be exposed to or to have in our libraries. But if folks are interested in seeing the specific list to cull it for specific titles, I'm happy to share that list in a follow-up.
Is Texas one of the states that has mandated Holocaust education?
I believe so. I mean, it is certainly in our state standards, yes.
And so are you aware of what some of these opposing views might be that they are now allowed to teach?
No. And let me be clear that I think what is happening is the expected or anticipated effect of a bill that is crafted with such vague language that educators, frankly, don't have any reliable way to know exactly how to implement it, exactly what it means for curriculum and for pedagogy in terms of classroom instruction. And so I don't mean any disrespect to this district administrator who was probably trying to make sense of a law that, again, I shared with you the text from the law that I think this person was trying to interpret, said, you know what? We're hearing a lot in our community. We have a lot of attention on our school district right now from these political candidates and from a subset of our parents. And I'm going to do the best that I can, which I would say is not good enough, quite honestly, to help our educators interpret this law as they enter a new school year. And so I think what was caught on record, and this was her, I think, being recorded by a teacher in a presentation where this question came up, this was more or less the response. And, you know, again, what I've seen just since is that this, of course, made a lot of headlines. And this understandably got a lot of educators in this community, as well as parents in the community, very upset about the law itself, and even threats, I think, from amongst educators that I'm not going to teach here. I'm not going to participate in a school district that doesn't more clearly understand their commitment to teaching the truth, that they would allow themselves effectively to be persuaded by a piece of legislation that I will say, quite frankly, doesn't have any state enforcement mechanism, but is really for local communities to interpret and to understand what it means and how to enforce it.
Thank you. Ramona?
I just want to point out that things are happening, legislation and boycotts and other things are happening very quickly. And the facts are not getting out. People are largely ignorant of what's happening. They're certainly ignorant of what's in the legislation. And there are a lot of knee-jerk reactions. And it's very easy to whip up a frenzy when you don't really know what's going on and you're trying to target, you're trying deliberately to whip up this frenzy. And I can't imagine what it would be like to be, for example, in your situation, Jonathan, where you want to create the best environment for teaching kids, and you have all this stuff swirling around where the kids are really just they're sort of the detritus. They're just sort of floating there and getting the rough end of what is really a political and and an unthinking political discourse, and not even a discourse, a political fight.
Right. Thank you for saying that, Romana. The reality is, like, that's why I'm here, I would much rather be waking up and focusing, as our teachers and school leaders are right now, about the fact that our students during the pandemic have really suffered. They've missed 18 months of really unfinished instruction, of really trying to adapt to instruction during the pandemic. And they're struggling right now. And the fact to me that we are having this conversation about education in our country, rather than what it's going to take to help get our kids back on track and to prepare them for success in college and career, and ultimately as citizens in our country, I think is unfortunate. And again, not where I would choose to necessarily spend my time, but this to me is something that we have a responsibility, I think, to engage in, and not to ignore and dismiss as somehow unimportant or not impacting our kids or our classrooms.
Thank you. Sheila?
Yes. Hi, Jonathan. It's nice to hear from you. And I just put something in the chat that I'm asking, isn't it a mistake to say that this is mostly influenced by political forces? The politicians like those in Texas or Trump thrive because they are tapping into deep-rooted racism and anti-Semitism feelings that now people have permission to say out loud and to express in government. Do you agree with that, Jonathan? You made it seem like it was a very political thing that's happening. Of course it is, but they couldn't do it without these deep-rooted feelings amongst the population that are now coming out.
I agree with that completely, Sheila. I wouldn't say it any differently than that. I guess when I say it, again, I'm coming from an educator standpoint and education standpoint. So I'm saying that this is political in contrast to this being about education at all. And right, I think, the art of, unfortunately, too often of politics is how to tap into sentiment, right? Not into rational or aspirational thinking or desires, say, for the next generation of children, but about what is often just below the surface, and maybe now increasingly above the surface, in terms of these emotional and I think divisions, right, that exist, rather than, I think, what is more likely to unite us.
Marjorie, you had a comment.
Not me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought that you did. All right. Okay, never mind. Sheila, do you want to take the second half of your question?
What was the second half of my question? Well, Jonathan, I wanted to know, when I asked about the teachers, I was a social studies teacher, and it's amazing. Back in 1965, and I was teaching about racism, Martin Luther King, and I got called on the carpet by my principal for being too liberal and from New York. But that was 1965, and I can't believe we're living through something similar now. So my question is, why aren't the teachers rising up? What are the teachers doing, their organizations, their unions, individually, just standing up and saying, I am not teaching in this school district. I can't do it. What about academic freedom and free speech? We can't have banning books and burning books. This is America. This is not Nazi Germany. I mean, what's going on, Jonathan?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for being that social studies teacher during that period. A lot of people don't wish to remember that at that time, Martin Luther King Jr., who everybody likes to quote and adore and make him whatever they may want to make him, had a 75% public disapproval rating. Many white Americans, they resented his condemnation of the Vietnam War, his Poor People's Campaign seeking economic justice, right? They labeled him a communist and a radical who was really attempting to, really trying to discredit the entire movement that, you know, at the time. And so, you know, I just think it's important to remember the ways in which, you know, I think especially Martin Luther King's name and teachings are used in this moment. You know, why are teachers not raising up? I think, look, I think the reality is that one, teachers wake up every day, first and foremost, focused on their kids. They do their best, quite frankly, to block out this noise because they have a duty and a responsibility, while everybody else has an opinion, to show up and to teach the state standards, to teach their kids. And that I think there's a deference, right? A perspective that, you know, I'm going to keep showing up and doing what I know is right. And that, you know, the second I start to get too distracted with all of the politics and the noise is kind of the second that maybe I take my eyes off of what my students need. I think the second thing is that, you know, teachers are really caught in the crosshairs here. I mean, I mentioned the fact that there are some amendments that prevent, you know, private legal action against teachers, but the law does create, you know, the potential for employment actions to be taken against them. And so, what is the most surefire way to probably get folks, recording your classroom or searching your Facebook profile to see what your political perspectives or views might be? You speak out, right? And trust me, there are educators and school leaders in Texas right now who are being targeted, who have lost their jobs or on, you know, not had their contracts renewed because they are viewed as standing up against some of this stuff. So I think it's a combination of both of those things. You know, kind of a focus on the right things, and also I think some well-founded fear.
So if I can just ask Jonathan, sitting up here in New England, as Karen says, we're not so safe either here in some of the things that are happening. What can we do to support you, to support the teachers, to support the right academic freedom and education in Texas? Because you are a bellwether for what may be happening all over the country, certainly in other what we call red states, not to mention maybe even blue states coming ahead.
Sure. Well, listen, I think, you know, first of all, paying attention, showing up to this conversation, it means a lot to me that folks in New England and in Connecticut care enough to just pay attention to what may not be happening there yet, but is happening in other parts of the state. Look, I think selfishly, there are lots of organizations that folks from anywhere can support again, to really help educate and inform other Texans about what's happening and give them the tools and the confidence to step into the arena, right? To speak up, whether that's at their local school board level or at the state legislative level. So that's certainly one thing that folks can consider. But I said something earlier that I think bears repeating, which is Virginia. And if you watch news shows or takeaways since Tuesday, this was a central part of the electoral outcome in what many considered to be a very quote unquote blue state. There hadn't been a Republican to win statewide office there for 12 years. And there's a Republican governor and many folks down ballot in the Republican Party who have won. And they have seized on this issue, I think specifically to continue to drum up and get turnout from what they consider to be the quote unquote Trump base, but also to tap into some of the fears, especially in predominantly white suburban communities, you know, to vote the way that they did. And that, you have to believe, is going to figure into the playbook of Republican candidates in every state, including perhaps states like the one that you're tuning in from. So I would say, you know, continue to pay attention all the way down to your local school board races, and start to see if this doesn't start to show up as the kind of wedge issue that partisan candidates take advantage of. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thanks, Jonathan. Mariah Feldman, you have a comment? You've typed a lot. I'm wondering if you would ask your question.
Oh, sure. I'd love to. Hi, Jonathan. Sorry, I can't put my video on, not very presentable right now. So definitely was very interesting conversation. But I keep coming back to anti-Semitism. And I wonder, what would you say, first of all, that we are a two-party country and pretty much divided in half, right? So I wouldn't label 70 million or whatever million of Republicans or Democrats one way or the other. So specifically, I wanted to ask, what would you recommend for Jewish community, how we can build relations with the other minority communities, which have some anti-Semitic tendencies, right? Like people like Louis Farrakhan, who is very outspoken anti-Semite. How can we improve relations between Jews and African Americans or Hispanics, which is very critical for our well-being in this country?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And I guess I always first of all say that we as Jewish people actually are a very diverse racial and ethnic community, whether we realize it or not. So that's the first thing is Jews is not different, is not white. Jews is not any one race or ethnicity. And that's a conversation that we can have as Jews amongst ourselves, right, within our community. I think your question is still well taken. And I would say that, first of all, I think it's really important to build personal relationships and relationships between communities. I mentioned I grew up in a Reform synagogue that was based in Durham, North Carolina. And I will tell you that it was our rabbi who was very, very active in forging interfaith relationships across all lines. I am the product of a Jewish education and experience that exposed me to the diversity of faith-based communities in my community where I was growing up. And that was one part, not the whole part, but an important part, I think, of being able to have productive, healthy relationships across lines of difference, right? And so, I think when we focus on the shared challenges that we have in our communities, right, and we think about how we can all be a part of solving those problems, we get over some of those things, or we learn how to talk to each other about maybe some of those, maybe more political or kind of different ideas. And I think that is such a necessary thing, for us to engage in as Jews. And then I guess the last thing I would say is, similar to the headlines, right, that I think are being ginned up now, let's maybe be a little bit skeptical of some of the headlines that we read, and check perhaps our knee-jerk response to say, well, there is a faction of, or there is a voice within, a group out there, and that somehow is reflective of the majority of a community. Because again, I think that is part of what is continuing to fuel some of what I talked about here in Texas. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Jonathan, you raise a really good point. And, we look to you as the next generation, clearly. You are on the younger side, and you're in education, and you are the future of where we're going. And I think many people are concerned with, number one, what the parents are saying, but number two, that when we say never again, sometimes that's translated into, we need to pay attention. This time we need to pay attention. We need to know what's going on. So the fact that you're in Texas is almost irrelevant, because it could be the seeds for the country. which is why we were anticipating your visit tonight, because it's not just Texas. Maybe it's where it began, but we need to be paying attention. And I think Marshall wants to follow up on that as far as parents and teaching.
Yes, Jonathan, I'm curious, do you think that parents should have a say in the education of their children? Because certainly if they have children in a private school, they have a say. So shouldn't parents in a public school have a say in what their children are being taught?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There is nothing more powerful or important than the partnership between educators and parents in the development and the learning of students. And that is a really, really important partnership. There are a couple of things I would say as it relates to today's conversation specifically, which is one, that educators and parents need to meet in the middle, and that they need to have a personal relationship as much as possible. And oftentimes they do. And a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of maybe a parent feeling like, oh, there was a classroom discussion that, you know, that maybe that bothered me, or that I got wind of, or maybe there was a book or a movie or something that, you know, maybe I wouldn't have recommended for my child. That's been happening forever. That's not new. And, you know, we've managed throughout this long history of public education to figure out how to resolve those differences first between parents and teachers as a community. And then if it comes to it, within our local school board and governance situations, right? So that I don't think we don't think we have a broken system as it relates to the role of parents in education. I think what we're hearing and experiencing now is, in my opinion, kind of a dangerous overreach, where we somehow think that you know, it's specific parents even that should be, you know, legislating what the specific curriculum should be, or you know, or you know, things like these book lists. I think that that's something that can happen, but we have local school districts for a reason, because we are able to resolve those questions about what is meaningful to our community, about the values that we feel like are important to reinforce, about the certain ideas that we want our kids to have access to and exposure to. And I think a lot of this, that's where this traces back to. I talked about Southlake, and just this one of many examples where that's happening, right? That process is happening, and it's not an easy one, and it's a difficult one, but to me, it's the right one. And making this about, you know, politics and state law and all of this, to me, is just, it's not necessary. And I think it ultimately does more harm than it does good.
Thank you. You know, while we're here looking for help, I will say that we'll offer you some help. We're going to send you some information on our Encountering Survivors program, where we go into high schools and teach children who most of them are not Jewish, not even so much what happened in the Holocaust, but that the Holocaust happened. It's that imperceptible, that tiny shift that has happened, that we are literally combating Holocaust denial, which is why this makes this discussion so important, because we have to be paying attention to what we're teaching our kids. Jonathan, I want to thank you for, oh, Romana, did you have a remark?
I just want to say that,
Yes.
you know, if we did just that, it would be okay. It would be good, but it wouldn't be great. And I think that one of the other things that we do is we try to, just like a lot of these kids in the high schools have never been in a Jewish home, or have never, and we invite them into the homes to see. And likewise for white students who have never had that kind of contact with Blacks. And we do the same thing with our Encountering Differences program with whites and Blacks, because it's part of our mission to not just take care of ourselves, but to get people to see the wider world and try to help promote justice in the wider world. And just like Jews were targeted as a group in Nazi Germany and in many other places, we need to be very careful when we hear about something that's happening in the education system that we like critical race theory, and we don't even know what it is. We need to be very careful not to target all Blacks as doing one thing. Everybody has there's diversity within every community, and we need to be cognizant of that. We need to help promote that, and we need to help promote conversations within our community and between our Jewish community and all the other communities around us.
Thank you, Romana. And Jonathan, did you have any closing remarks?
Gosh, you said something earlier. First of all, I'll be 40 in February, so I'm not that young.
Oh, yes, you are.
At least I don't see myself that way. There were two things I would just say. One, you're making me think about probably the most powerful experience I had as an educator, which is, again, I taught in rural North Carolina. A lot of kids who'd never been outside their community. We took kids to Washington, D.C., to the Holocaust Museum after having read such powerful texts like Elie Wiesel's Night. I mean, it's a part of the curriculum in that school that I taught in. And these were mostly poor Black and brown kids with whom I was the first Jew they ever met. And I will just tell you that what they took from that experience was universal. For a universal empathy for what it means to be human and what it means to stand up for others. And then the second thing I said, you said, or you put something on me and said, you're the next generation. And I'm reflecting on what that means because you asked, which is that, and I think it's what was underlying some of the other questions. If we don't build coalition with those who we don't view like ourselves, then I think that we are under threat in America. And I think that it is so important. I think the younger generation, which is even younger than me, they know that, they recognize that, they're hungry for that. They want to stand up for injustice, not just when it impacts people who they view as like themselves, but for so many other people. And I think if we give students the knowledge and the freedom to learn that, they will be the ones who create that better future. And so I think our future is in good hands as long as we don't get in their way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening. Thank you so much.
You up?